The icy wind cut across the forest ridgeline as dawn struggled to rise through a ceiling of heavy gray clouds. Snow clung to every branch, turning the woodland into a maze of silence where distant artillery echoed like distant thunder. In this frozen corner of the front, a lone infantryman crouched beside a muddy depression he had carved through the night. To most of the men around him, it looked like a waste of effort, a shallow, waterlogged pit that offered no comfort and barely any cover. But the soldier kept digging, driven by an instinct he could not explain, scraping frozen soil until his hands were raw and numb. To his platoon, the man's behavior bordered on obsession. They teased him, calling the hole the puddle, and wondered why he spent precious hours reinforcing something that looked ready to collapse. Mud seeped around his boots, and icy water pooled at the bottom, but he pressed on with quiet determination. All around him, others chose drier ground, higher vantage points, or abandoned buildings for shelter as they prepared for the bombardment they feared was coming. In the bitter cold, comfort seemed more important than caution, except to him. The bombing began shortly after sundown, a barrage so violent it shook trees from their roots and turned the ridge into a cauldron of fire. Buildings crumbled, trenches folded. Every position the men believed was strong enough to protect them vanished under the storm of explosives. But when the smoke cleared and the shattered forest fell silent, a single figure emerged from the mud and frost, alive, bruised, shaken, but breathing, inside the worthless foxhole no one believed in. This is the story of the hole that saved his life, and the instinct that kept him digging. Snow drifted in slow, swirling patterns as the platoon moved into position along the broken tree line. Their breath fogged the air, mixing with the low rumble of distant explosions. The men were exhausted, many having not slept for more than a few hours in days. Their boots were soaked, their uniforms caked with mud, and their nerves worn thin. The front had shifted without warning, pushing them into unfamiliar ground where the enemy's artillery could strike without prediction. In these conditions, every soldier sought whatever comfort he could find. While most rushed to claim spots inside a half-collapsed farmhouse or clustered around fallen logs offering partial wind cover, one soldier, Private Samuel Huxley, scanned the terrain for something different. Instinct tugged at him as he traced the contours of the snowy earth, looking for a depression that seemed safer than the rest. The others didn't understand. They wanted warmth. They wanted walls. But Huxley wanted earth above his head, even if it was wet, cold, and miserable. He found the low spot near a tree stump, barely a dip, little more than a soggy hole filled with half-frozen mud. The men nearby laughed. "You'll drown before you get shelled," someone joked. But Huxley ignored them, shouldering his entrenching tool and driving it into the soil. Every strike splashed him with icy filth. Every shovel of earth deepened the dark little cavity. Within an hour, he was soaked, shivering, and covered to the elbows in mud. Yet he kept digging. As daylight faded, the temperature plunged. Frost formed along the edges of the incomplete foxhole, turning the mud into a slushy mixture that clung to everything it touched. Huxley worked through numb hands and trembling limbs, occasionally stopping to breathe into his fingers before continuing. The platoon sergeant passed by twice, shaking his head. "You'll freeze in that thing," he warned. "Find a wall or a roof, something solid." But Huxley didn't move. Inside the old farmhouse, the men stacked crates and broken tables into makeshift barricades. Its thick stone walls and partially intact roof felt safe, warmer, at least, than the open ground outside. They joked about Huxley's mud pit as they lit a small lamp, shared rations, and tried to forget the distant thunder of artillery. Warmth, they reasoned, meant survival. Shelter meant protection. By the time the sun vanished behind the treetops, Huxley's foxhole was a narrow pit just deep enough for him to lie flat, with a low ridge of frozen earth forming a crude lip along the edge. The mud was up to his knees, suctioning around his legs with every movement. He lined the sides with branches and whatever debris he could find to prevent collapse. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't pretty. But every instinct inside him whispered that it would hold. Night descended fully, bringing an unsettling quiet. The wind faded until the forest seemed to stop breathing altogether. That silence, heavy and unnatural, settled over the men like a lead blanket. A few soldiers gripped their rifles tighter. Others tried to sleep, murmuring that the enemy wouldn't attack in such cold. But Huxley felt something in the air. Pressure, tension, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Just after midnight, a distant whistling sound pierced the stillness. One man inside the farmhouse sat upright. Another cursed under his breath. Before any of them could react, the first shell landed far to the west, lighting the tree line in a pulse of orange light. A moment later, the second exploded closer, much closer. Huxley threw himself flat inside the muddy pit just as the bombardment began. The ground heaved, trees snapped like matchsticks, stone walls shattered under the force of direct hits. In an instant, the forest was ripped apart by fire, smoke, and thunder. And above him, the frozen, reinforced earth of his worthless foxhole held steady. The artillery barrage intensified, pounding the ridge with a fury that defied comprehension. Shells landed in rapid succession, carving deep craters into the once frozen ground. Shrapnel howled through the air, slicing through branches and tearing chunks of earth from the forest floor. The farmhouse, which had seemed so sturdy hours earlier, absorbed the first impacts with cracks, but soon succumbed to the relentless strikes. Inside his foxhole, Huxley pressed himself deeper into the mud. The dirt walls vibrated with each impact, showering him with loose debris. But the earth above him remained largely intact, shielded by layers of compacted mud and frozen soil. The air in the hole was thick, damp, and suffocating, but it was still breathable, still alive. Beyond the lip of his pit, he heard distant screams, the sound of stone collapsing, and the final, splintering groan of the farmhouse roof giving way. The world above had become a maelstrom of flame and destruction, but beneath it, buried in mud and darkness, Huxley held on. Huxley's ears rang from the concussion waves that crashed over him. Each detonation felt like a hammer smashing against his ribcage. Dirt cascaded into the foxhole, landing beside his helmet in clumps. He could feel the earth shifting slightly with every explosive impact, but it never fully gave in. The mud seemed to absorb and cushion the shock waves, distributing their force rather than collapsing. Smoke drifted low across the ground, seeping into the foxhole in thin wisps. Huxley pulled his scarf over his mouth and forced himself to remain still. Moving now would only destabilize the pit. Above him, everything shook violently as the shelling continued. It felt endless, minute after minute of violent chaos, but he refused to lose focus. He closed his eyes, breathing steadily through the fabric, letting the layers of earth protect him as the world tore itself apart. He had trusted this hole. Now it was trusting him to stay calm, stay hidden, and stay alive. At last, the tempo of the bombardment slowed. The gaps between explosions grew longer, each pause stretching just enough for hope to flicker. Huxley lifted his head slightly, listening to the forest gasp back to life. Distant crackling fires, collapsing debris, and the soft fall of ash-covered snow. His muscles ached from the tension, but he forced himself to wait. With trembling arms, he pressed upward to test the stability of the foxhole's rim. The frozen earth above him had compacted even tighter under the barrage, creating a hardened crust that now felt almost like stone. It had taken the beating better than he had imagined. The mud, the cold, the miserable construction, everything that made it seem useless, had saved it. He slowly pushed himself up toward the opening, careful not to break loose any weakened sections. His hands emerged first, coated in frost and dirt. Then his helmet broke through into the open air, smoke swirling around it. For the first time in hours, he saw the forest again. And it was unrecognizable. The farmhouse was gone. Not damaged. Gone. A crater the size of a swimming pool now sat where the structure had once stood. Broken beams lay scattered in charred fragments across the snow. Trees were uprooted, split, or burning like silent torches. The trenches and dugouts his platoon had made were obliterated, their outlines erased by the sheer force of the barrage. Huxley crawled fully out of the foxhole, his legs stiff and numb. He stared in shock at the devastation. Snow and mud had fused into a dark, uneven landscape. Human shapes lay partially buried beneath the rubble, motionless. Equipment was scattered, twisted, and ruined. The positions that had seemed safe hours ago were now death traps turned inside out. He staggered to his feet, gripping a tree stump for balance. His breath froze in the air. His heart pounded. He was alone. And the reason he was alive stood behind him. A muddy pit no one believed in. He stumbled through the destruction, calling out for survivors. His voice echoed across the empty ridge but returned without response. The silence was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that came only after unimaginable violence. Snow continued to fall in thin flakes, settling on the ruins like a cold shroud. Huxley checked the collapsed farmhouse first, lifting broken boards and pushing aside debris with frozen fingertips. Nothing moved beneath them. He forced himself to continue searching, stepping carefully across the cratered ground. He found helmets, gear, and torn fabric, but no signs of life. His platoon, the men who had trusted the building's walls, had vanished under the barrage. The realization hit him like another explosion. He dropped to his knees, exhaustion and grief crashing over him. But the wind swept past him, carrying the cold truth. He had survived because he chose the worst ground. The mud had been his shelter, the ice had been his armor, and the ridicule had been irrelevant. Hours passed before reinforcements arrived, startled, confused, and wary of what they saw. Huxley sat beside the foxhole, still covered in mud, staring at the crater where his platoon had once stood. The newcomers approached with caution, unsure if he was wounded, delirious, or simply in shock. "Where were you when it hit?" one soldier asked quietly. Huxley pointed to the mud pit behind him. The reinforcement team exchanged glances, disbelief on their faces. They examined the foxhole, tracing its construction, noticing the reinforced walls, the way the earth above had compacted into a natural shield. What had seemed worthless was now a marvel, a fluke of instinct and engineering that had defied destruction. Word spread quickly among the arriving units. Some called it luck, others called it miraculous. But to Huxley, it was neither. It had been a choice, a decision to trust his instincts even when others couldn't see what he saw. In the days that followed, the ridge was transformed into a field of salvage operations. Engineers and sappers studied the foxhole, measuring its depth and analyzing the soil composition. They noted how the damp, collapsing mud had absorbed shock better than the rigid walls of the farmhouse. They questioned Huxley about how he reinforced it, why he dug so low, and what made him choose that precise spot. Huxley struggled to explain. "It just felt right," he told them. "The ground was soft enough to dig deep, the slope angled away just enough. And I thought, if a shell hits nearby, the mud might hold." His simple reasoning baffled them, but the evidence was undeniable. The worthless foxhole had become a case study of instinct over comfort, practicality over appearance, survival over assumption. Huxley's story spread through nearby units like wildfire. Soldiers began choosing low ground, wet ground, even unpleasant positions over conveniently dry ones. The idea that a miserable foxhole might save them replaced the common belief that comfort meant safety. Officers quietly adjusted their defensive guidelines, emphasizing earth depth over structural shelter in bombardment zones. Huxley tried to move past what had happened, but every night he saw the faces of the men who didn't make it. Survival weighed heavily on him. He didn't feel heroic, just lucky, and perhaps guided by something deeper than thought. Yet, when patrols crossed the ridge days later, they found him near the foxhole again, quietly repairing its edges as if preserving a memory or a grave. Winter eventually loosened its grip on the battlefield. The snow melted, revealing once hidden scars in the earth. Craters filled with water, burned trees toppled, and the muddy foxhole, now hardened by frost and time, remained exactly where it had stood on the night that changed everything. Huxley was reassigned, sent to a quieter sector to recover and regain his strength. But as he departed the ridge, he paused to look back one last time at the place that had been both his prison and his salvation. It was small, ugly, and unimpressive, yet it carried the weight of an entire platoon's fate. Long after the war, survivors and historians would debate the instincts of soldiers, the geometry of blast waves, and the unpredictable nature of survival. But on that bleak night, one truth had become undeniable. Sometimes, the path to life lies through the place everyone else overlooks. And sometimes, the hole that saves you is the one no one else believes in.